The 1690s is a period of Scottish history more depressing than the Bertie Vogts era. Harvest failures in 1696, 1698 and 1699 created famine conditions which resulted in the most severe mortality crisis faced in Scotland until the introduction of the deep-fried Mars bar. Mortality rates in some parts of the country reached as high as 20%. That's about the same as your average ICE agent. The famines created a migration crisis with over 50,000 people fleeing the country, most going to Ireland and continental Europe. There was a 13% decrease in Scotland's population and a 5% mortality rate across the nation on the whole. This places the Scottish famines of the 1690s alongside the more well-known Great Famine of 1846, which wiped out the potato crop in Ireland and the Highlands of Scotland in terms of its severity. It was, quite frankly, the worst possible time to be alive. Food prices were out of control, there was rampant inflation, economic stagnation, war, and the country has been led by a sociopathic orange man. A truly terrible time to be alive. Scotland had experienced famine throughout the 17th century, but it had been over 60 years since anything this severe. Agricultural improvements throughout the 17th century had increased crop yields to the extent that by the 1690s, most people thought that this sort of thing was no longer possible. The Scottish people had suffered through some truly bleak periods, and now they just kind of assumed that things would start to get at least a wee bit better. How wrong they were. Many people believed that the famines were a result of divine intervention. God was punishing the Scottish people. Up to this point, he'd already given us the shitest weather in Europe, midges and some fairly antisocial neighbours, but he wasn't done with the Scottish people just yet. And so the 1690s saw a brief return to the kind of religious zealotry that had been seen in the country in the middle of the 17th century, because, you know, it had worked out so well for us the first time around. The last recorded witch trials in the English-speaking world occurred in Scotland, in Renfrewshire, between 1696 and 1700, where 60 people were indicted on charges of witchcraft and 6 were strangled and burned at the stake. The actual cause of the famines was, of course, climactic. The 1690s was colder than previous decades, and this would affect the crop yields of northern Europe. A slight change in temperature would result in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people across Europe. But you know, we don't need to concern ourselves with that sort of thing these days. Every area of the country was affected by the famines, with mass burials and food riots recorded in every part of Scotland. 1 in 6 Scottish people were reduced to begging. That's around 200,000 people in total. But the starving poor were not the responsibility of the government, they were the responsibility of the church, and to a lesser extent, Martin Lewis. Relief centres were set up in parishes across the country, such as here in Greyfriars Kirkyard in Edinburgh, but there was nothing like enough food to go around everyone. There are conservatives in this country with something of a nostalgia for Scotland in the 1690s, and in their great wisdom they thought it pertinent that we should take a kind of back to the future style trip back to the 17th century and reintroduce food banks for a 21st century audience. God bless them. King William was unmoved by the problems that Scotland was facing in the 1690s. Despite the colourful parades that his supporters liked to put on for him, William was a notorious Scotophobe. He took no interest in Scottish affairs or Scottish politics. He never once visited his northern kingdom. As far as William was concerned, a pound spent in Croydon, from a strict utilitarian calculus point of view, was far more beneficial to the country than a pound spent in Strathclyde.